Dusty Discipleship Podcast. In Jesus' day, a disciple was known for following their teacher so closely, the dust from his feet would cover them. And that's what we're after here. Not just learning from Jesus, but walking so closely with him that his life shapes ours. Today we're in Matthew 2, and we're not just given details about Jesus' early life. Instead, we're shown a clash between two kingdoms, one built on power, control, and fear, and another built on peace and restoration and trust in God. As Jesus enters the story, people respond in very different ways, and those responses reveal something deeper, not just about them, but about the kind of king Jesus is and the kind of kingdom he brings. My name is Mitch, and I'm excited for what I got for you today. Let's jump into it. Welcome back to the Dusty Discipleship Podcast. My name is Mitchell Feliciano, and this is episode 2, Matthew chapter 2. I'm excited. If you haven't already, go back and listen to episode 1 with Matthew 1, and we talked a little bit about who is Jesus, and we talked about the kind of king Jesus is and stepping into the story of just messy and broken people. And today we're going to talk more about what kind of king Jesus is, and specifically looking at Matthew chapter 2 and kind of just asking the question of what kind of kingdom are we living in and what are we trying to do with our lives? And so as we dive into this and as we hope to become dustier as we follow behind King Jesus, I hope you've taken a chance to maybe browse through or just look at Matthew chapter 2. If you haven't, it is retelling the story of the early Jesus' life. You see a lot of the things that we're familiar with. If you've grown up in any sort of Judeo-Christian value household, especially here in America, Matthew chapter 2 is a book of the Bible, or a chapter of the Bible, I should say, that is pretty familiar to you. It's telling a story that I think all of us are familiar with. It starts off with retelling the story, or should I say just telling the story for the first time, of the wise men who visit from the east and King Herod meeting them and trying to beguile them and trick them, and Jesus and his family having to flee to Egypt, and then Herod killing all the newborn children. And it kind of ends with this really interesting passage about Joseph having a dream and going back to his hometown, not of Bethlehem, but of Nazareth. And so as we look at it today, I'm excited. This chapter has been big for me. And as I have dove more into the Word of God and just tried to consume as much content as I can about the Bible and such, this chapter really, I think, frames a theme that has been set up in the entire Bible. And hopefully you will feel the same way as well. And so with that, in Matthew 2, the big juxtaposition, or the big idea that the chapter here is trying to set, I think, is this idea of two kingdoms. And this will be a term that I'll probably mention quite a few times if you continue to listen to the podcast. And it's the idea that the Bible wants to compare and contrast the empire and the kingdom of God. And some theologians just call it empire and the kingdom of Shalom. And some just call it the idea of two kingdoms. And this really is seen as we look at the beginning of the chapter, especially, and even through the end of the chapter. But you see this really represented on one side with the theme of empire. And empire is represented here by this king called Herod the Great. And Herod is a king that is not a Jewish king, but rather he was a friend of Caesar's. And a lot of Herod's history is one of playing the right side. You can read through history and you can see that Herod does a really good job of pitting Cleopatra and Octavian against each other, and what does that look like as Octavian will become Caesar Augustus and just plays his cards right and becomes this Jewish king. And he's not fully Jewish. He's probably maybe partially Jewish based off what some history tells us. He could have potentially have converted to Judaism just so that he could have been the Jewish king. But he is this king who is extremely wealthy. He comes from a region called Idumea, and he is a king that is this big middleman. He's built his wealth off being the middleman, specifically probably in the spice trade. Some scholars say it's just your generic run-of-the-mill spices. And as you remember, if you've sat through a history class, spice was like gold. And Herod probably made his money off that. I've also heard from other scholars that the big spice that Herod made his money off of was this generic Viagra, was almost seen as a sexual stimulant, and it just kind of adds to this opulent perversion of who Herod is. But he's known for this. He's known for building the temple and expanding it even bigger there in Jerusalem. He builds this massive city called Caesarea in this opulent display of wanting to curry favor with who Caesar is. He builds this city of Herodium and what this looks like for him. And he's known for this paranoia and this violence. He will kill his own children trying to make sure his throne is secure. Some people think he drank mercury and as such just, descended into madness because of the effects that mercury can have on you. And this response to Jesus by killing all the children is not something that is out of the ordinary for Herod. And what we see is Herod pictures perfectly this theme of empire in the Bible. This idea that I must control everything. I am in fear of losing things and I will act out of fear. You see this in self-protection. Empire often wants to protect itself. And as you look throughout the Bible and you see that theme of self-protection, that really pops up as well. And also just the idea of preserving power and doing so at any cost, doing so at the cost of anyone else. And that's really what Herod does. And on the other side, juxtaposed, is this new king that's born, and the wise men come to visit him and give him kingly gifts. And you see that he comes with this idea of wholeness and restoration and peace and trying to bring life as God intended. And this theme will track through the entire Bible, which we'll look at in a second here. But the idea of who King Jesus was supposed to be is something we can trace back through the Old Testament, even with messianic prophecies. And so as you look back at passages like Isaiah 11, which Isaiah is looking at the idea that creation will be restored, and when this Messiah, when this king shows up, predator and prey will be at peace, right? And you might hear this as the lion and the lamb being able to sit next to each other. Isaiah also talks about the child being able to play with the cobra, or I believe it uses the word adder if you read the King James, and this idea of a kid playing with a snake, which is such biblical imagery, because of course a snake is the main reason Adam and Eve fall, because they are tricked by this snake. And once the creator shows up, the snake again becomes harmless. And it's showing this world where violence and fear are no longer present, which are big elements of what empire brings. When the Messiah comes up in Isaiah 9, it talks about this coming king who's not going to rule by oppression, but rather by justice and righteousness and lasting peace. And it's such a powerful, powerful chapter that Handel will make his Messiah have these words. And if you've ever been a part of a Christmas concert where the Messiah is played and people stand up when this chapter is sung, because it's such a powerful picture of what this coming king is going to bring. Micah 4 also talks about this coming king, and it says that nations will no longer be preparing for war, that weapons will be made into like tools of life. And it's like this reversal where I no longer have to protect myself. Imagine a world where our nuclear weapons are used instead to bring about life, or where guns are broken down and melted down to make farm implements and tractors, or just things to make life better. And that's what Micah's picture of the coming Messiah will be. And the beauty of this is it's not just this one story here in Matthew 2. Instead, this is a picture that goes all the way through the Old Testament. And it's something that starts at the very beginning in Genesis, where you see the idea of God beginning this kingdom, and he places Adam and Eve in the garden as co-rulers with him in the garden, meant to bring about change and to rule and to garden and to rule efficiently. And they do so until they are tricked by the person who is, personifying empire at this time, which is the snake, which is Satan. And you begin to see that battle. And God will even tell Eve that one day you will have someone who will come and crush this serpent. And you see already the battle between the kingdom of God, which, I may just refer to through the rest of this episode as Shalom, which often is just a biblical word meaning peace, and kind of this idea of whole restoration and this idea of what God wanted the world to be in Shalom there. And that's what God brings versus empire. And you see that already at the beginning. You see it especially at the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus when this Pharaoh rises up and oppresses God's people. And you see him worried that um, the Israelites are going to rise up and he's threatened by his power. So what does he do? He kills a bunch of babies, which is a direct echo forward to what's going on with Herod. And Herod is echoing back to what's going on in Egypt. You see it in the wilderness as the children of Israel come out. And they begin to wonder if they want to go back. And you see this empire still living strongly in their hearts. You see it in Saul, where he leads from fear and insecurity, worried that his kingdom is going to be ripped from his grasp at any point, doing things that he shouldn't be doing, being impatient, not wanting to wait for God, wanting to do what he wanted. You see it in the life of David pop up here and there, but more especially you see it pop up in the life of Solomon as Solomon begins to hoard wives and hoard wealth, and he accumulates all that wealth and power, and he forms alliances with Egypt, which if you go back to the book of Deuteronomy was a big no-no. God says, when you have a king, I do not want him to go down to Egypt for anything because I brought you out of Egypt. And Solomon goes down to Egypt. And what's so fascinating is that as Solomon builds his military strength, you read there as the people are wondering if this is the most amazing thing ever. He counts, I believe it's his talents of gold, and they number 666. And it's just like a fascinating little picture there that Solomon isn't doing what he's supposed to do. He's building empire. You see it in the story of Esther as the people of God are in exile, or not quite exile. The exile's over. They're still living in this kingdom. And Haman wants to destroy them out of fear, out of wanting to be influent and be powerful. And the king makes these decisions and does so unwisely, whether it's with his first wife Vashti or it's with the whole Esther story. And you see just the shrewdness of Mordecai and Esther and the way God works in a book where the name of God is not even mentioned once. You see him working through there to defeat empire and to say, this isn't what's going to happen. And this happens all throughout the Bible. These are just snippets, but you see it pop up in Abraham's life when he takes advantage of Hagar, or when Isaac lies about his wife, or when Jacob just like tricks his brother over a bowl of soup or chili or stew, whatever you want to call it. You see it in the life of Jacob's sons as they wrestle and they fight, and as they throw Joseph in the pit because he's the favorite, or as they lie and they cheat and they steal, as they go into a city and slaughter hundreds, if not thousands of men because of a wrong that was done to them. And you see empire just pop up over and over and over again in this theme. And once you're beginning to look for it, it's hard not to miss. It's hard not to see anymore, because empire is not a place. It's a pattern. It's what pops up when you are scared. It's what pops up when you want control. It's what pops up when you want self-preservation. It's this idea that I need to have power at all cost, and I can't give it up, and I don't want to do anything else with it. And Jesus shows up in this empire. He steps into not just a neutral world, but he's stepping into this world shaped by it. By the time Jesus shows up, so much of all of culture and life has been inundated with this empire. And if you know anything about Jewish history, especially a couple hundred years leading up to Jesus, it's just been empire after empire after empire stepping in. And this has begun to completely take hold of these people's lives. And Jesus steps into this. And you see a guy like Herod ruling and so worried that he's going to lose his power that he's willing to kill his own children, that he's willing to go to an entire city and slaughter just hundreds, probably hundreds of babies who are all under the age of 2. And you see how quickly empire can twist and transform. And you see it rearing its ugly head throughout the entire Bible. And it gets to this point with Jesus. And you just have to almost ask yourself, how did we get here? How did we get to this point? And the beauty of a chapter like this, and hopefully as you read it, you're kind of starting to ask yourself, what does my life look like? The beginning of the Israelite story, where it really starts there in Egypt. And as they come out, they leave a king who kills all the baby boys. And now that very thing is happening inside of Israel. And you wonder in our own lives where we have been marked by empire, where we have been abused, where we have had traumatic things happen to us, where we have had spiritual abuse, where sin has impacted us, where people in our lives who were very empirical in their thinking left that mark. And now we are stuck and doing it ourselves. And it's rearing its ugly head in our own life. And we see ourselves operating out of fear and operating out of power and operating out of self-preservation and just slowly but surely transforming into Herod. And where those times where we want to look at Herod and say, man, he was crazy. I would never do that. I would never hurt someone else to protect something I have, to protect my throne, to protect my family. And we see ourselves slowly begin to justify it. And empire starts to pop up. And this is what Jesus steps into. He steps into, I said it a second ago, not just a neutral world, but this world now shaped by empire. And you have to ask yourself if this reminds you of the world today. The time of this recording, it's mid-April 2026. We have a war going on in Iran, or you could call it a military quagmire, but it's a war. You have people fighting over oil. Ukraine and Russia are going at it. Israel and Lebanon are going at it. You have multiple, just smaller cultural wars going on. Here in America, Americans are so divided, whether it's on race, whether it's on ideologies, whether it's over political lines. And it is just so scary when you look at the world around us and you just see that empire is not gone. It's still rearing its ugly head and still popping up as politicians worry about losing their seat in the Congress, the House, the Senate, the presidency, local races, and are willing to do whatever. You see it in people willing to step over their neighbor because their neighbor voted Republican or their neighbor voted Democrat. Well, my neighbor is this, so I don't do anything with them anymore. I won't watch out for them anymore. And Jesus steps into a world just like this 2,000 years ago, and he's still stepping into that world today. And as you continue to read through Matthew chapter 2, there are 4 different groups of people who respond to Jesus. 4 different groups who have a very clear response to Jesus. And I hope as you read this, you begin to look at your own self and see what your response is to Jesus and the way he stands up to empire. The first group, or the first person, is Herod. And Herod's obvious. Herod resists the kingdom that Jesus brings. He's threatened by this. He clings to control. Empire fights back when it's threatened and when it's had this whole thing happen. You know, I'm a big Star Wars nerd. I have been for a long time. I can remember being, man, I don't know how old I was when episode 3 came out. I had to maybe be in middle school. Maybe it was even earlier than that. And my next door neighbor, a guy by the name of Dave Augustine, got a bootleg version of episode 3. And in fact, I don't know how he got it because part of the movie wasn't quite finished yet. And it was like, you know, I'm sure this wasn't legal. But we're watching the movie. And I just remember watching this, knowing what's going to happen as Anakin Skywalker burns alive and becomes Darth Vader. And you see the rise of the Empire. And there's this line in there that Anakin Skywalker's wife says as she sits in the Senate and as the Emperor begins to announce that the Empire is now taking the place of the Galactic Republic. And she says something along the lines of, and this is how democracy dies, with thunderous applause. And I think about that so much because that's what empire does. Empire fights back. When it's threatened, it just grows and it feeds off of sin and just the things in its life. And we see in the life of Herod. He's unwilling to give up his throne to this king of the Jews. He's unwilling to do what he wants to do or what Jesus wants to do. So he will do whatever he has to do. And you wonder, is that my response to Jesus when he steps into my life? Am I resistant to that? The second group of people are the religious leaders. In the story, you'll read, or hopefully you've already read, that Herod will go to these religious leaders and he'll ask them, who is this Jesus? And they know. These people are so inundated in their scriptures. Jesus will interact with them in about 30 years after we're reading this story. And they know everything. They know exactly what's going to happen with the Messiah. They know that he's coming to bring change. They know that he's coming to overthrow Rome. They know that he's coming to put a stop to empire. And even if they're a bit twisted in thinking that maybe he's going to be a military leader, they do nothing. And so where Herod was resistant, the religious leaders are apathetic. Notice none of them show up to worship the king. Notice none of them ask the wise men if they can tag along. Instead, they're just apathetic. They say, sure, we know the prophecies. We know that he's going to be born in Bethlehem. We know that the star is a sign, but we don't want anything to do with it. And you have to ask yourself, if like many Christians today, if Jesus is coming, if his kingdom being here has just led you to apathy, are you just sitting back, not really caring? You know what Jesus' message is. You know what he's there to confront, and you don't want anything to do with it. Number 3, the third group of people are the people in Jerusalem. In the story there, it'll say that there's almost like a disturbance, that they're like disturbed by this. They're troubled. They're unsettled, might be a better word for it. And so where Herod resisted and the religious leaders were apathetic, for some people, Jesus is very disturbing. Disturbing of like, I have my own routine, Jesus. I don't want you to step into it. Disturbing in, Jesus, you want me to do what? That doesn't sound like something I want to do. You're disturbing what I have. You're leaving me unsettled. I am troubled by that, Jesus. Is that how you feel when Jesus steps into your life? When he confronts the empire that you've built? Does that trouble you? And lastly, and maybe most importantly, we see the Magi, these wise men from the east, and they show up. And when Jesus steps into the story of humankind, they worship. And so where Herod resisted, where the religious leaders were apathetic, where Jerusalem was disturbed, you have worshipful Magi. We call them 3 kings in our songs. And I love that picture of kings bowing down to the king. Some scholars think that as you think of Magi from the east, there's a potential they come from people who had studied under Daniel, and he had told them that one day someone was going to come and you were going to look for it. I don't know if that's true or not, but I love that picture that maybe for hundreds of years, these men were part of a group that was just kind of holding on for the ultimate king. And when he shows up, they move, they seek out, they sacrifice years of their life to travel. They sacrifice gold and myrrh and frankincense and these beautiful oils, all to say, we know you're the king. And the question you got to ask yourself is that when Jesus has stepped into your life, when he has confronted the empire of your life, will you worship? Will you sacrifice? Will you seek it out? Like Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is like is like a man who found a pearl in a great field, and upon finding it, he sold all that he had. Are you willing to do that? When Jesus steps into your life, are you willing to sell all that you have and follow him? Or are you going to be like the other 3 groups and find yourself resistant? Are you going to find yourself apathetic? Are you going to find yourself disturbed and troubled? Or like the Magi, will you bow the knee? Will you take years off your life? Are you willing to leave your family behind? Are you willing to give up great fortune just to follow Jesus? Because in each of these 4 movements, each of these 4 stories, it's the same king. It's the same moment, but it's different responses. It's different people looking at Jesus in different ways. And so as we look at that, we have to see then, what is Jesus's response to empire? And some of this you're going to see throughout the book of Matthew and even through the rest of the Gospels, because Jesus doesn't grasp power. Paul tells us that. He doesn't fight like Herod. In fact, he tells Peter to put away the sword. He doesn't build his kingdom through control. In fact, he sits in a garden and says, not my will, Father. I give up control. Instead, Jesus moves towards the vulnerable. Jesus welcomes the outsiders, and he trusts his Father. And Jesus just lives differently within the system, because Jesus embodies a different kingdom in the middle of empire. So today, as you listen to this, and hopefully as you read Matthew 2, I encourage you, because most of us don't live outside of empire. We live inside of it. And no matter what your political denomination is, if you're American, if you're European, if you're African, Asian, if you find yourself sitting in a country that is completely free, where I can sit in my basement and very openly record a podcast talking about a Christian book, if you find yourself hiding in a house where you are unable to openly express that you follow Jesus Christ, all of us live in empire. Somewhere along the lines, someone has taken control and empire reigns in some ways in all of our lives. And that's just how it's going to be for us. But being dusty, following Jesus, being covered in the dust of our teacher means that we have to walk so closely with him, that we live like him. And that means we do that in the middle of empire. Remember, Jesus will pray in the Gospel of John, and he will say that we are living in the world and we're supposed to be in the world, but we're not of the world. And so as we live in the middle of this empire, as we live in the middle of a kingdom, we have to ask ourselves, which one is shaping us? So I leave you with a reflection question today. Where do you see empire in your life? Do you see it in the way you have operated your family? Do you see it in the way you've operated your romantic relationships? Do you see it in the way you treat money? Do you see it in the way you have followed the political beliefs of one party or another? Do you see it in your spiritual life? Do you see it in your physical life? Do you see it in the myriad of different ways it can be? Where's empire today? And how are you going to respond to Jesus? Will you be like Herod and resist and feel threatened by? Will you be like the religious leaders, knowing the truth, but too apathetic to really care? Will you be like Jerusalem and be disturbed by what all this has for you? Or, and hopefully, are you going to be like the Magi? And are you going to sacrifice and sell and travel and seek and move and operate like Jesus in the middle of empire? We all live in a kingdom. We have to ask ourselves which one is shaping us. Will it be empire or will it be the kingdom of Shalom? In the next episode, we'll continue the story. We're going to look at John the Baptist, the baptism of Jesus, and maybe talk more about how it reveals how Jesus' kingdom will begin to take shape. Thank you so much if you took the time to listen to this. I hope you take the time this week to think more about empire and the kingdom of God and which one is shaping you and which one you're operating in. Hopefully you were encouraged and hopefully you find yourself a little dustier today. My name is Mitch, and I hope you have a good rest of your week.